All right. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming today. This is the third webinar in a series on key biodiversity areas put on by the KBA Secretariat, the Global Center for Species Survival, and the IUCN SSC. This webinar will be recorded, and a recording will be available on YouTube afterwards and can be shared with anyone. The last webinar in the series will be in 2 weeks on March 21st, and we will share registration links at the end if you haven't already registered for that. If you have a question, it's best to submit it using the Q&A feature, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, because it'll be easier for us to see the questions that way. And at the end of the presentation, we will have Olivia answer the questions. If you want to introduce yourself and where you're from in the chat, that is totally fine. And now I'll let Olivia take over and introduce herself and get started with the presentation.
Thanks very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for joining the call. So my name is Olivia Crowe. I'm the Global Science Coordinator for Important Bird and Biodiversity Areas and Key Biodiversity Areas with the BirdLife Secretariat based in Cambridge. And I'm also co-chair of the KBA Technical Working Group. I'm going to stop my my video so you can see the full screen when I put it on full screen mode. So firstly, a recap. You guys have had a couple of sessions at this point on KBAs and are probably quite familiar with them, I'm sure. So as you know, KBAs, or Key Biodiversity Areas, are sites contributing significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity in terrestrial, freshwater and marine ecosystems. So the vision of the KBA programme is that a comprehensive network of sites that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity is appropriately identified, correctly documented, effectively managed, efficiently resourced, and adequately safeguarded. KBAs, once they're identified, need monitoring. So they need monitoring so we can check that they're maintaining the values that make them KBAs in the first place. KBA monitoring can also provide information about the effectiveness of any actions that are taking place at the site, such as conservation management or any legal protection. KBA monitoring is also important for identifying a call to action for any sites that need urgent action. It can be used to inform policy, influence donors and decision makers, and it forms the base of a range of indicators for reporting on the Convention of Biological Diversity, UN Sustainable Development Goals, among others, and it informs a range of other policy fora and global and regional and thematic assessments, such as Global Biodiversity Outlook, for example, and IPBES. It informs global and regional scale advocacy and communications. So in 2018, the KBA Technical Working Group, which is a group of representatives primarily from the KBA partner organizations, that aims to ensure that KBAs are appropriately identified and documented, and that monitoring efforts of the KBA partners are implemented. So with the TWG and with support from the KBA Secretariat and the chair of the Special Appeals Committee, we set out to develop a monitoring strategy for KBAs. And we identified a number of key objectives. The first one is the development of a monitoring protocol. We also wanted to provide access to global data sets. So this includes a range of data sets that are now available that can support monitoring assessments. They could also include citizen science data sets. But we also wanted to identify and develop supports needed for monitoring biodiversity at individual sites. And we also have a job of work to define the outputs and metrics from monitoring assessments and to define the role of the World Database of KBAs, or also known as the WDKBA, in supporting monitoring. So some of the key timelines and milestones in the process have included initiating that framework that I mentioned in 2018, so this for the KBA strategy. We developed a specific subgroup of the KBA TWG to take forward the monitoring strategy. and also to work on developing that draft IBA or KBA monitoring protocol. So the aim of it then, once we had the protocol developed, we took it to a selection of potential practitioners to seek their feedback. So we did that work last year. And we've also made some progress with other strategy elements that I've already mentioned. So moving on to talk specifically about the monitoring protocol. So it's developed to track the condition and change in condition in KBAs over time. So they're meant to be ground up assessments carried out at each site, ideally every 4 to 5 years. And it's a snapshot of the site's condition. It involves monitoring the populations of the species or the extent of and condition of the ecosystems for which the site is important. And it also involves identifying the threats and the threats to the sites and their impacts on the qualifying species and ecosystems. It's reliant on participation and collaboration. That's a really important part of it. It's important that anybody who has knowledge about the site or indeed the species and ecosystems in some cases should take part in monitoring assessments. And this could be any combination of folks. It could be KBA national coordination groups, national organizations, or individuals familiar with the sites and values of the site, such as site managers, taxonomic experts, and many of you guys, I'm sure. So in considering a suitable protocol, we first reviewed many of the existing protocols that are already in place, covering a broad diversity of schemes. So there are more than 70 or so monitoring methods identified under the Protected Area Management Effectiveness Framework, or PAME. And most of these are based on around the IUCN World Commission on Protected Areas framework. And they're centered around 6 key elements: context, planning, inputs, process, outputs, and outcomes. So we did a deep dive on some of these main global data sets and the monitoring schemes themselves, with a view to trying to see what some of these other methods were doing and what would be potentially quite useful for KBA monitoring. We looked at some of the bigger global ones, such as MET, or the Management Effectiveness Tracking Tool, RAPAM, which is a rapid assessment and prioritization of protected area management, and IMET, the Integrated Management Effectiveness Tool, and the IBA Monitoring Protocol, which is BirdLife's protocol for monitoring important bird and biodiversity areas. We also looked at a range of others, such as the IUCN Conservation Outlook Assessments, Common Standards Monitoring, EU Natura 2000, and we also looked at the Green List. So we found a lot of commonality across these methods. They all gather threat data, which is very useful, and most of them use the IUCN Threat Classification Scheme, so there's commonality there. Most of them provide some assessment of the impacts of the threats, and most of them provide an assessment of conservation measures in place, so site protection, conservation action, and so on. The greatest differences were probably due to the focus of the methods, or the differences in the focus of the methods. Most of the focus of most of the methods were on the outputs, so the products and services, and the outcomes, which are the achievements with respect to the site. And there were relatively few with consideration of the site values, although that is changing as some of these monitoring methods are changing over time. So we found that many of the scoring questions from these PAME assessments are not really applicable or relevant to KBAs. And these are questions such as those relating to budgets, infrastructure, staffing, and so on. But critically, for a KBA monitoring protocol to work, we recognize that there's going to be a huge variety of expertise involved. And so any protocol that we form, it'll need to be relatively simple and yet sufficiently robust so that we can inform the condition of KBAs. So we agreed on a state pressure response approach similar to that adopted for IBAs. This allows a focus on the qualifying species and ecosystems. And this is an approach that's been used for IBAs over the past couple of decades. So it measures state, which is the current status of the triggers within the site, pressure, the pressures and their impacts on the triggers, and response, which reflects on any conservation measures at the site that may remedy the impacts. And for each site, for each assessment rather, a single 4-point scale score is generated for each of state pressure and response. And these can be compared over time to measure trends. And the score for state and pressure is based on a weakest link approach. So to simplify the process, we've identified the weakest link for state and pressure so that folks don't have to, and what's actually happened is we've found over time that folks tend to focus on the state of the species that's been faring worst, or the pressure that's been highest impacting. So sites with high impacting pressure scores are potential IBAs in danger. So this was an initiative that started in 2013 with the main objective of identifying sites that are in most urgent need of action. So this graph here just shows an overview of progress to date. So the number of sites that have been monitored over time between 2000 and 2022. And just looking at this in a few different stages, the protocol was launched in 2005. So prior to that, there was quite a lot of testing, especially in African countries. So we got quite a few monitoring assessments through then. And then, as I mentioned, the IBAs in danger was launched in 2013. So you can see those blips in or increases in the number of sites that were monitored in those particular years. And in terms of how many assessments we've got to date, so we've got just over a third of IBAs have had at least one monitoring assessment. And the Venn diagram here shows that there's been a mix of information in those assessments. Many of the assessments don't manage to provide all of state pressure and response in these assessments. So just a little less than half have managed to do state assessments, for example, whereas quite a lot of them have managed to generate pressure assessments. And in terms of the number of years monitored, you can see from this one that the majority of sites have been monitored once only. So despite our best attempts, especially in the earlier years, we've struggled to get folks doing multiple assessments over time. But a few countries have embraced IBA monitoring and are using it very regularly. So this latter part of the graph shows the sites that have been monitored on more than 7 occasions. And Nature Kenya is one country that really has embraced IBA monitoring. They have been monitoring sites for more than 20 years now and using it with quite a lot of success. And a lot of the success has been due to the broad collaboration. It's not the BirdLife partner solely that does the monitoring. They bring in, or they work with a number of different institutions and organizations to achieve their monitoring. They also have the involvement of the site support group, and they spend a lot of investment in training and also in feedback to folks that are taking part in these assessments. And I mentioned earlier, the IBAs in Danger initiative started in 2013 with the main objective of highlighting those sites in greatest need of action. So we've learned quite a lot from the IBA monitoring framework, and we've had quite a lot of feedback over the years. And so we've done a bit of thinking about some of the feedback and how we might address that in taking a KBA monitoring protocol forward. So one of the main considerations was the fact that capacity is quite limited. It has been quite limited across the network. We've identified potential solutions in devolving the responsibility to others, just as Nature Kenya have done. Sites don't need to be monitored every year, so it's possible to rotate batches of sites in different years. And it should be intuitive to try and carry out monitoring assessments wherever there is activity at a site. So any site that's been surveyed or regularly managed or whatever, those sites should be considered for regular monitoring if possible. So at least there's a selection of sites that go forward. And in terms of scoring, the scoring has been a little bit inconsistent, and we have been aggregating the ordinal scores across sites to sort of show things are faring at a broader scale than site, which isn't not necessarily all that appropriate. So we've identified ways of dealing with that, such as calculating based on the actual numbers that are provided, and using categories which are more intuitive. And as I mentioned earlier, the weakest link approach has resulted in us receiving incomplete data sets in some cases. So, to achieve a monitoring assessment, really the assessor only needs to provide the assessment based on the species faring worst or the pressure that's highest impacting, for example. It would be a much more robust process if we can get a more all-encompassing monitoring protocol, not solely focused on the weakest link. And as I mentioned earlier, expertise is key. We've identified that that can be quite limited, and folks have felt that training and support has been lacking at times. So we definitely need to consider that with the KBA monitoring protocol, improving and having regular communications with folks that are taking part, and providing workshops and webinars such as these. And we've also had some issues with capturing data, and as you know, that we're developing the World Database of KBAs at the moment, and hopefully we can build monitoring into WKBA in a streamlined way to help folks, taking them through in a stepwise way, and have things like import capabilities and linkage to information from other data sets that will all help the process. So where have we landed in terms of the KBA protocol? As I mentioned, we're dealing with state pressure and response. So state is the abundance of the trigger species, the extent of the trigger ecosystem types, or the degree of ecological integrity with the site relative to a benchmark. And that benchmark has been identified as that based on the population of the trigger when first identified at the site, because at least we know that that information exists. We recognize that it's quite hard to get updated information on the populations of species or an ecosystem extent over time, but at least we know that when the site was first identified, or the species was first identified as a trigger at that site, that we will have information there. So that's what the benchmark is defined as. The information we need for state includes any of the 3 points that are shown. So ideally, an update of the assessment parameter that was used when the site was first identified, or if it's more appropriate to use another assessment parameter. So, for example, it might be more appropriate to use a number of burrows, a number of nests, or something else, and that's fine too. So anything that's giving a good reflection of how the species is faring or how the ecosystem is faring at the site is fine. It may be that we just don't have that information, and it may be that the only way of getting a state assessment is for someone to provide an assessment of the estimate of the proportion remaining based on categories that we've agreed. And this could be inferred from a number of things, such as indirect observations, and that could be, for example, such as change in water levels over time for an aquatic species, and you might be able to infer that the species has changed its population based on that. It could also be related to the extent and condition of the habitat, especially where we know that there's a relationship between the species and the habitat, the ecosystem and the habitat, or it could be based on expert opinion. And just these are the agreed state categories, and you can see that there's a range of positive categories and those below unchanged. And for ecosystem condition, we're proposing to use the same categories, although there's a little bit more work to be done in terms of defining how that is to be determined. In relation to pressure, this is defined as the threats that are affecting or have the potential to affect the trigger species or the ecosystem types or ecological integrity and their impacts. So firstly, the pressures affecting triggers based on the IUCN threat classification are listed. And then for each pressure trigger combination assessment of scope, which is the proportion of the site level population affected, and severity, which is the decline caused by the pressure, is made. And then a single scope severity category is generated. And you can see from the diagram at the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there, on how we're planning to integrate scope and severity to generate that category. And we will also assess timing, so when the pressure is taking place and impacting the trigger. But that will be mostly used to assist us with the interpretation. It won't be part of any sort of scoring. And then response relates to the conservation measures of the site, and it's based on three main elements. It's based on the proportion covered by protected areas and or OECMs, on the extent and comprehensiveness of management planning at the site, and on the extent and comprehensiveness of conservations at the site. And we're also going to ask assessors to provide us with information on the conservation actions at the site using the IUCN conservation actions and research needed classification schemes. We'll look for information about those actions that are relevant to the site and the triggers, and also those actions that are currently underway. So it'll be useful to have that comparison. So we have had plenty of challenges along the way. Defining an approach for KBAs that considers all species and ecosystems, and one that works for criterion C and criterion E, which are the criteria related to ecological integrity and irreplaceability. So that has been quite challenging, and we're not there yet, but we're mostly along that road, hopefully. We recognise that some changes and tweaks will be needed to the protocol, especially in the next 12 months to 2 years. There are uncertainties about what will work for ecosystems. Ecosystems KBAs are only just starting to be identified now. The definition of benchmarks has also been challenging, especially the implications of using different timelines when KBAs were identified. Also, when you have a KBA with lots of different types of triggers, with different timelines as to when they were identified for the site. So it's been, in developing the protocol, it's been quite a balance between data requirements and achieving high quality assessments and protocol complexity, and yet keeping it simple enough that we can be inclusive of information from a variety of people. And we will have a number of mechanisms for capturing quality information along the way also. Guidance will be needed to help assessors that are dealing with sites with many triggers. So we have some sites that have hundreds and the odd site that has more than 1,000 triggers, and we can't expect people to be having to do assessments for all of those. So we'll certainly be providing guidance on how people can try and define specific indicator species and triggers that will be useful. And we're currently looking at how all of this information can be integrated into WDKBA in a simple and user-friendly way. The role of the WDKBA is now up and running for assessments and reassessments. That will be to guide the assessor through the process, the monitoring process, in a stepwise manner. We'll be able to use it to prompt the assessor about previous monitoring results so that we can ensure consistency. We found with IBA monitoring, there have been some inconsistencies, for example, in the pressures that have been identified, just depending on the people who were involved at the time. So at least having the WDKBA being able to prompt what was assessed or what was identified the last time around will certainly help. WDKBA will perform some of the calculations where needed, such as the scope severity output category. And we'll also use it then to generate the outputs that can be used in various platforms. So, as mentioned earlier, there is now a wide range of data sets that are available that could potentially support KBA monitoring. These include remote sensing data sets. We're currently working with Planet and Atos, which are two organizations that deal with remote sensing products, about the potential development of bespoke layers that will be of use to KBA monitoring. And there are other global data sets also. We're also working with WWF to access KBA relevant metrics for a variety of their site infrastructure data sets. Some of these data sets are hosted in dedicated platforms such as Google Earth Engine, and being able to access and analyze the information within the Google Earth Engine platform is really useful because it removes the need for us to have to download massive data sets that are many terabytes in size. Some go a step further to develop their own websites, such as this one here, which is Global Forest Watch. And you can see this is a particular site here in Southeast Asia, and the pink on the map shows the forest loss over the last 20 years. And the graph just shows for this site the number, or the area of tree cover that's been lost in each year between 2000 and 2020. So we had a Cambridge Conservation Initiative funded project in 2019 that focused on, or that allowed us to scope some of these data sets in a more detailed way. So we were able to access them through Google Earth Engine and identify or generate KBA relevant metrics from them. And this here is just an example of some of the data sets that we looked at. And we've since been able to use some of these data sets in some projects where we've also got ground-based expertise, and it's been quite an interesting exercise finding that the remote sensing data sets are quite useful, but not always the most accurate, especially at the KBA level, and especially where the KBAs are quite small. So that's been quite useful. But also it's important to note that in many cases, we'll be using these remote sensing data sets to help us with pressures. And in some cases, we know the pressures that are impacting on the triggers, and they're not always the ones that are most prevalent, that look to be most prevalent from remote sensing data sets. So it is quite important to have that bottom-up interpretation of some of these data sets. KBAs are now integrated into eBird, and we're also having discussions with GBIF about potential access to global datasets and biodiversity. These data sets will probably help us most with assessments and reassessments, but they do have the potential to help us with monitoring also, especially assessments of state. We all know that biodiversity monitoring in general is poorly coordinated, and it's often quite haphazard, and it suffers from taxonomic, regional and methodological biases. It's beyond the capacity of the KBA technical working group to get involved in advising or developing species monitoring protocols or even setting priorities. But we do acknowledge that we need to support those out there, that especially those that are dealing with taxa that are quite hard to monitor and so on. This information is critical for state. And in practice, we know it's going to be challenging for many species at many sites. And if you remember that Venn diagram that I showed earlier, less than half of sites that have been monitored for IBAs were able to generate state assessments. And that's for birds, which is a relatively well-studied group. So inputs from experts is going to be key in this process. Some of the objectives that we in the technical working group have identified are to identify a mechanism for compiling and disseminating best practice examples where proposers and NCGs have been able to integrate data from monitoring schemes into their KBA assessments and reassessments. So some consultation with you guys and species monitoring specialist groups would be really helpful here. We have an action upon ourselves to make that contact, and hopefully that will happen soon. There are many large-scale reassessments and assessments underway, and many of them are availing and integrating a huge range of data sources. So getting all this information into one place and having it available will be very useful. So moving on to some of the ways that we're hoping to disseminate these monitoring achievements and outcomes, we're thinking about two main ways. We're thinking about KBA fact sheets, which will be the site level summaries, and a KBA dashboard, which will be a broader summary infographics that make sense at a broader scale than site level, but also at site level too. So aggregating things up to national, regional, global, and so on, and maybe even taxonomic level too. So just looking at the fact sheets, as I mentioned, looking at that would be the site level outputs. They will be summary level of the state pressure and response assessments, potentially looking at a traffic light indicator system, which would be quite a nice way of illustrating sites that are, or whether state pressure and responses in a favourable condition or not. And for each site, we will aim to display the relevant statistics and show general information from the monitoring assessments. And then, as I mentioned, With the KBA dashboard, we'll potentially have another tab in the KBA dashboard that's on the website at the moment for dedicated to KBA monitoring that shows some of those infographics at wider scales. We also recognise that other PAMA schemes may be useful sources of information, and indeed vice versa. And it would be important in considering this that the schemes are gathering similar attributes, so it's crosswalkable if you like, and also that they show good spatial correspondence. We did complete an evaluation of these a few years ago, finding that it was just met data that were available, and when it came to looking at the number of sites that corresponded well spatially, it dropped it down quite a bit. But I think over time that's definitely going to improve, and there's definitely it's definitely worthwhile thinking about how we can potentially be useful in as sources of information, as well as some sinks in terms of hopefully getting some information from these schemes. So we also we now need to develop a KBA monitoring dashboard. So this is another dashboard, it's a different dashboard to the one I was mentioning earlier. This would be a dedicated dashboard that would store and make available some of those KBA relevant metrics that I mentioned earlier, and would be accessible from the WDKBA. So people that are doing their monitoring assessments can access this. It'll be really important that we give some time to think about how we present that. There's going to be potentially quite a lot of information available, and if it's not carefully presented, we risk confusing the user. We know that not all data sets would be useful to all sites, so we can certainly filter things through habitats and potentially a few other attributes. We also recognize that the user may want to look for some further information, so we'll need to be able to provide further information on those data sets too. So what are our next steps? Well, we want to build the monitoring fields into the WDKBA and launch the protocol. So we're currently working on that at the moment in TWG. We've identified that training and webinars will be really important in this process, and face-to-face wherever we can manage it. We want to develop the KBA monitoring dashboard to host and serve all the KBA metrics from these other data sets, as I was just saying, and to work with Planet and others to potentially develop some bespoke data sets that will be particularly useful for monitoring KBAs. We also need to agree on a set of metrics that will be useful to inform the condition of KBAs and at a variety of scales. And it'll be really important to consult you guys in particular and species specialist groups to help inform us in the technical working group on what we can do better in terms of supporting biodiversity monitoring. So, and I mentioned earlier, we also need to give time to reviewing this at some point. We haven't had a huge amount of testing the protocol, for example, so we will need to maybe review it in 12 months to 2 years' time to see how it's working, what's not working, and what tweaks we can make to make it a better scheme. So I just want to finish on this one, and it's the potential role of the species monitoring specialist group in KBAs. So KBA is explicitly mentioned on your website, in the application of tools and outputs, and a couple of other places. The specialist groups focusing on particular threats will be really useful. So feedback from those, for example, that are working on invasive alien species, that would be really useful to help us establish the invasive alien species threats at KBAs where that's applicable. Some of the taxonomic groups contain scientists and conservationists that will be collecting data at the site level, especially those sites for which the species occurs at very few sites. So that's an automatic. That's a really useful piece of information. And as mentioned earlier, any inputs that we can get from experts in terms of helping with assessments of state would be really useful. So that's how the triggers are faring at the site. We know that's going to be quite challenging. So species experts that know how species are faring will be really useful in this process. We recognize that we need a mechanism to allow this flow of information, and we haven't bottomed that one out yet, but we'll certainly be coming back to you guys in due course on that, and hopefully you'll be able to input to the process. So thank you guys for joining the call this afternoon, and Also thanks to colleagues in the KBA Technical Working Group who have been taking forward this monitoring strategy, and also to others in BirdLife who have also inputted to the process to date. So thanks.
Great, thank you, Olivia. Now we'll take questions. So if you have a question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We have one right now, so I'll read it out to everyone, and then Olivia, you can answer. First question, so we understand that OECMs are quite different in the approach, recognizing Indigenous people and local community rights and participation in decision-making compared to traditional protected areas. Are there any adaptations or changes that have been done to this methodology to apply to promote equity and justice in the conservation practices for OECMs?
I can't answer that for OECM specifically, but for the KBA process, which I'm sure has pulled from a lot of the processes that are out there, there is quite a stringent consultative process involved when it comes to Indigenous peoples and local communities. So it is quite comprehensive. The KBA process is very comprehensive.
Okay. How would the KBA monitoring integrate with the efforts to update trigger species within KBAs? It would seem most logical that the monitoring follows an updated trigger species, so it's of greater value and is more complete.
Absolutely. So for KBA assessments and reassessments, the idea is that they are done every 8 to 12 years. I think it's really a matter of timescale. We're recommending every 4 to 5 years, but recognizing that it could well be every 8 to 12 when assessments and reassessments are done. And yes, finding a way of making that flow happen between the reassessments and letting that flow into state will be a very important part of this process.
Okay. When a KBA is triggered by a particular species or group of species, is there a mechanism to seek input from a relevant SSC specialist group to review data on that species?
There isn't a mechanism yet because we're in very early days of this monitoring protocol. As I mentioned, we haven't quite launched it yet. But we are hoping it's very much on our agenda to make contact with the specialist groups, and that will be done. That's certainly on target for this year, and hopefully, as part of that process, we can identify a mechanism that will allow the flow of information.
Great. Any other questions? I don't see any more right now. Okay. One more. Do you have strategies for enabling monitoring of more remote sites where monitoring might be less convenient or more difficult?
We're hoping that in time, certainly these remote sensing data sets that I was talking about, or the other global data sets that are not necessarily remote sensing, will be quite useful there. And we know that they are constantly improving. They're certainly improving as we're going forward. And as we start to potentially use them in collaboration with the ground up information, we'll become better able to identify what the quality of that is. So hopefully some of those remote sensing data sets will be quite useful. And it may be that it would be quite useful to hear back from yourself at some point as to what data sets might help that process if it were to be, to some extent, automated into the future, so that we can maybe look towards developing them.
Great. Someone asked, they're interested in the nitty-gritty. Could you give examples of the full monitoring suite applied for a couple of KBAs? It would be helpful for understanding the contrast between sites.
Yes. So this is looking for It might, yes, I think the short answer is yes, we can provide that information. I don't have it on the top of my head, I'm afraid, but if you come back to us, we can certainly provide you with some information that we have, for example, from IBA monitoring that might help address what your query is. So sorry, I can't be directly, I can't come back to you directly on that one.
Great. Okay, that's all the questions I have right now. Olivia, maybe if you're willing, could you put your email into the chat box so people
Sure.
Could contact you directly if they want to?
Yes, absolutely.
And if we don't have any other questions come in, thanks for attending. I put the registration links for the last webinar in the chat. So that is on 21st March. That'll be our last one in the series. Like I said, this recording will go on YouTube and you'll get a link to all of the recordings from all the sessions once the series has ended. So I don't see anything else come in, so I think we'll go ahead and wrap up for today. So thank you, Olivia, and yeah, we're free to go.